Okay, well let's get started again. So Prof. Arvind and I are going to talk about literature reviews, where literature reviews are probably, it's one of the most important parts of establishing your area, and definitely a skill that lots of people need to develop. So what we're going to talk about the purpose of the review, how to generate the list, some things to think about in how you're reviewing these papers, and mixed in there's going to be things to do and things to avoid. So we're not going to be talking about how to select your research area, because this is something that you have to do together with your advisor, and we're not talking about specifics of use EndNote to store a PDF and add tags in a specific way, because there's lots of tools out there. We're going to get some of that later, but what we're talking about more is the theoretical level of what we're trying to accomplish. We're also not going to talk about shortcuts on how to review a paper. There really aren't shortcuts to how to review a paper. We will give one little tip that will help you decide which papers to read, but that's still going to involve lots of work, so it's not a huge shortcut. So the purpose of a literature review is to demonstrate knowledge of what has went before you. You have to use your knowledge that you are going to develop to demonstrate themes and how people have tried to solve these problems in the past. And the themes can be the methods that they use, the tools that they use, the strengths and the limitations of the approaches that they've used. And you have to use this body of knowledge of reading lots of papers, including some papers that you may not initially think are your research area, that you need to use to establish your own novelty. So if you don't know what has been done in the past, you can't possibly know what's new. And so if you write a paper and you send it to a conference and don't demonstrate that you know what people have done in the past, no one will believe you if you say that what you're doing is new. And so it's much better to be over-inclusive and include papers that are sort of related but not very directly related than to be under-inclusive and eliminate something because it's not exactly like what you're trying to solve.
And I think literature review also includes, you will often be surprised that what you really want to do, techniques for your problems or whatever, has already been done in different areas. Not necessarily you're working in FPGAs. You look at papers in that area, that sure, maybe you won't find a solution, but elsewhere, people have already done that. How often that happens? All those multidisciplinary research areas, right, where bioinformatics or whatever, how do they come about? That's exactly what happens. Yeah? People have already done tons of work out there, not necessarily in your area, and keep an eye, keep an ear, everything open for that.
There's a good example of that. So a lot of Russian researchers in the late 1990s, whatever, published a lot of papers on complexity of VLSI circuits, and they published it in Russian journals. Now I'm not suggesting all of you learn Russian, but it did make a difference, because later on an American researcher from Brown stumbled upon these and said, we've been claiming that we are novel for so long, and these Russian guys have been doing it for much before us. So it's important, if you're bilingual, I think it's a great idea to sort of be up to date in research in your area as well.
Yeah, potentially, yeah. So that's another example where you need to be more open to reading stuff which is not necessarily in your area.
And this, this does bring up something that I think all of us, the professors in this room, but also NTU as a whole, is more and more emphasizing interdisciplinary research. And it's for this exact reason, because maybe we don't know about a particular method to solve a problem, but when we go and talk to somebody in chemical engineering, or we talk to somebody in the medical school, or we talk to somebody in a social science. Maybe they have statistical techniques or algorithmic techniques that we're not familiar with, but when we take a step back and use critical thought, we can say, oh, this method could be applied to my problem. And so sometimes it's not about having a paper that uses the exact same terms and the exact same system that you're trying to do. It's about finding people that have solved similar kinds of problems, even if it isn't described in the same way.
So from the two papers I mentioned in my talk, geometric programming and machine learning, these were two ideas from completely different fields that got pulled into the FPGA field. And these papers are good exactly for this reason, that they're applying techniques which were never tried in the FPGA community before. So you'll never find prior art. And you have an opportunity to be the first ones to bring in a technique into your area if you read outside your domain.
And I mean, another thing to keep in mind is if you look at how we interact with people, you as students probably interact with a wider variety of people, yeah, in terms of backgrounds and stuff, as opposed to we advisor. We are generally tied to our area, our school, or whatever. You go back to your grad hall, you meet people for dinner, whatever. You interact with a whole bunch of people from different areas. Use that as an opportunity to learn about other areas.
Yeah,
maybe something interesting is there for you.
Yeah, I mean, a third great example that I think a lot of us in this room maybe take for granted now is the CAD algorithm simulated annealing. What is simulated annealing? It's somebody a long time ago now looked at the process of how you anneal metal to make a mixture of two metals that is stronger than the better, than either individually. And when they thought about this process of how things are moving rapidly at first and then slower later, they thought, wow, this sort of is similar to what might work well for CAD algorithms. There's a really different jump between making metals and running CAD, but simulated annealing is now a very popular algorithm for doing certain kinds of CAD algorithms.
Genetic programming.
Genetic programming as well.
Yeah.
So when you're generating a reading list, your list will quickly expand to hundreds of papers. This is a good thing, and it expands for multiple reasons, and we need to cover all of these reasons. The principle of First Foundations is to make sure that you know what the source of this whole field is coming from. So you want to give credit to the original inventors, but there is a limit. We don't have to go back everybody to calculus and cite Isaac Newton or Leibniz, depending on your camp for calculus. We can take some assumed knowledge and start from there, but it can be important to go back to the first sources. In my own PhD thesis, some of the earliest papers that I cited went as far back as the 1960s, because some of the original study of scheduling algorithms on systems started in the 60s. And you want to say, this is where things started. But you also need to handle the principle of most recent updates. If your most recent citation in your conference paper is from 1966, people will say, you may not realize it, but research has continued for the past 50 years. And so you need to demonstrate that you know what's happened recently. Because I've seen this actually even recently. I've reviewed papers for a recent conference where somebody says, I'm going to implement AES. And they cite 30 papers that people have implemented AES. But curiously, none of those papers was newer than 7 years ago. And I could do a quick Google Scholar search and find thousands of papers that have implemented AES, and many of them within that past 7 years. So when you don't show that you know what's most recent, people aren't going to believe you when you say that you're doing something new, because you don't even know what's been done since, you know, since 2000. How do you expect me to believe that you know what's new? The final one is the principle of not being offending. So I know it's sometimes tempting to say, oh, I'm in competition with this other group, so I'll not cite them because it'll bring down their H-index by a half point if they don't get my citations. But demonstrating that you know what's going on is important to demonstrate everything of what's going on. Don't offend people by excluding works unless you have a really good reason to exclude them. If they're truly unrelated to your work, and then yeah, they don't get cited. Or if they are critically flawed and they don't deserve to be mentioned at all, don't cite them. Any other reason, if you know it's related, it should probably go in.
And anyway, if you plan to cite Isaac Newton, please come and meet me. I would like to be your best friend. I'm going to be famous soon.
So,
yeah. Yeah, so if you're really lucky, you and your advisor are the first ones to think about what you're working on. So you don't have to worry about literature review. But how many of us are that lucky? Yeah, go talk to your advisor and change your problem. Yeah. So of course, we need to read up on a lot of stuff before we even start thinking about results. Okay? Because otherwise what's going to happen is what you think is novel has already been done 20 years ago. Yeah? And that, how often does that happen with you? Yeah, you spend a week, oh, this is so cool. You go to your advisor and like, are you kidding me? Yeah. Yeah, so that's a short way to get a paper rejected. You don't cite a paper which is really relevant, which has been done before. Imagine the reviewer, whose paper it is, getting your paper with no reference, no citation, how pissed he is, or he or she is. So be very careful about that. Okay? Don't, as he said before, don't miss a paper. I think that's more important. It's okay to cite some of it being irrelevant is okay. I think it's good to err on the side of caution. Be careful. Strategies for building the small talk.
Yeah, so there's a lot of different strategies for starting to build your list. So over the next couple slides, we'll go in a little bit more detail about each of these. You know, keywords, authors, different infrastructures, conferences and journals, doing forward and backward searches based on who has referenced this paper and what papers does this reference. But one way or the other, these different strategies just are for seeding your list. So you're going to, in practice, you're going to be combining these techniques and cross-referencing. So maybe you use the author search to help you find more keywords. And then with the author and the keyword, you find different infrastructures that have been used to solve the problem. And then between all three of them, you come up with a good list of conferences and journals that are likely to have publications related to you. And when you have all of that and you find some good ones, then you start looking for the historical trend of where did this research come from and where is it going now. So any individual strategy isn't enough, and we have to combine them. So
actually, one quick thing to mention here is that Google Scholar is intelligent enough that if you populate it with things that you're interested in, it will come up with suggestions of recently submitted papers in that broad area. So yes, you need to keep doing this regularly once every so often, but you can use technology to assist you in keeping up to date with what's going on. And Google Scholar is one very good example of a tool that makes suggestions to you that, oh, you should read this paper based on what you've read before.
Yeah, I mean, you know, if you look at my phone, I'm not that tech savvy. So when they say search here, keep in mind some of these literatures, really good ones, they are in print. Yeah, you might not get them online. Don't ignore them. Your textbooks, some really good papers from the 50s and 60s, you might not find them online. I mean, it has happened with me in the past. Yeah, I look at a reference, oh, that looks interesting. I search for it. I spend a couple of days. I didn't find it. I give it up. Don't do that. Go to your library, get a copy. Yeah. It's a bit of hard work. It's It's a bit of hard work, and they will get it for you, right? Don't worry about that.
Another thing to mention is, maybe you'll mention it. You talk about survey papers.
Not specifically.
Okay, I think it's sort of important to mention that if you're sort of getting into a new field, that you sort of search for things that are survey papers which look at the different problems, different things that people have tried in that area. And they tend to give you a very quick way of kickstarting your spreading search of different publications.
Yeah, that's a good one. But be very careful. There are a lot of survey papers which are not good. And they are published. Okay. So ask your advisor, what is a good survey paper when you want to start with something else.
And one good recommendation is to use IEEE Computer or Communications of the ACM as two very good conferences that have improved in quality significantly. CACM in particular has excellently written articles that anybody can read with some technology background. So if you're a new student, try and make sure you read survey papers and try and make sure you read magazines in addition to these detailed research papers from conferences and journals.
That's, well, and I guess maybe the last point about survey papers is if you look for a survey paper in what is going to be your area and you don't find one, then there's a need. And so talk with your advisor and help them, they'll help you figure out how you argue for the survey paper, but you have to do this work anyway. You have to write your thesis, you have to write a related work section. So if you can find an area that needs a survey paper, be the person to write it, because then everybody else will be looking to you for how to define the field. And if you're the one that defined your field, then you've put yourself in a good situation for all of your papers that follow. So to be specific about the keyword search, there's some things that you have to think about and be careful about when you're generating your list of keywords that you're going to use to find papers. There's synonym issues. You may think that you're working on reconfigurable systems, but there might be a lot of people that are doing very, very similar things, but reconfigurable never appears in their paper because they say adaptable. Or maybe they use runtime configurable instead. So you have to think about the fact that just because you found a term that you think you're going to use, other people might be using other terms. And so using some of the other searches to find other terms that people might use is an important part. And similarly, there can be anti-synonym problems. People love the same words over and over. There's tons of different definitions of adaptive and virtualized, and everybody means a slightly different thing. And so just because a paper has that word doesn't mean it's definitely related to what you're doing. And so you have to read it with a critical eye and figure out, is this paper actually relevant to what I'm trying to do? And finally, there can be lots of acronym problems. This is, maybe especially an issue in Singapore since everything has to be an acronym. And everybody thinks that they're really smart when they can come up with a great TLA for their project. We always want to come up with our 3-letter acronyms, and we want to be intelligent about having Greek references or mythology references when we put together our project. But do you have any idea how many projects use the term chimera to describe their project because they think it sounds really cool to have something like this? No, that means that when you search for chimera, there's thousands of different projects from entirely different fields that do this. And so it's going to complicate your search, but you're going to have to wade through this and maybe think about it when you're thinking about your own titles is, how am I going to make something that's going to be easy for people to find?
I do think titles are important. I do think acronyms are important because it makes it easy for people to reference your work. Yeah, there is the problem that you can alias the same acronym over and over again. So you have to be smart enough to create a unique acronym that actually makes sense. It's okay to be cute once in a while, but don't go for cuteness, just go for functionality. That your acronym is guaranteed to be unique.
Yeah.
I mean, another thing to point out here is I'm not sure how many of these search engines actually search through PDF files. I mean, they might look for titles and abstracts, they may search through that, but not the content. So there is a trade-off. Be very careful about the keywords you use. If you are too descriptive, you might end up missing a lot of papers. At the same time, if you're not descriptive enough, you might get a whole bunch of irrelevant papers. Yeah, it's a skill. It takes time, so don't worry.
So within the author group, you want to try to identify the so-called famous research groups, which means academia famous, not real famous. We shouldn't see citations to Brad Pitt or Angelina Jolie. We want to see citations
or
to
Wikipedia.
No Wikipedia. No, we want to see citations to somebody who is famous among our group of nerds that think writing good programs makes you
If you
famous.
don't know who is famous, ask your advisor. If your advisor doesn't know, it's time to switch your advisor.
It's okay to cite a very nice science fiction movie as inspiration for your work sometimes.
Yes. So, and then, but don't just take famous as only the top people in the field. You might want to follow people's careers. Students, like the three of us, not more than about 2 or 3 years ago, become professors. And sometimes we continue our research from what we were doing as a student. And so if you see somebody that did some interesting papers as a PhD student, make sure to add them to your list of people to see if they continue to do research in that same area once they're no longer working with the famous professor. You also have to look for other sort of not so famous groups. Young people, small schools, they still want citations, and they still will be very offended if you don't include them because you only wanted to cite Berkeley and Stanford and MIT. So you want to find the people that are doing the related work, just not necessarily just the most famous.
And then keep in mind, although the reviewer might be someone famous, but he might actually not be doing the review. He's going to give it to some of his students. If you don't cite the student's paper, keep that in mind.
And you know, you'll see this across the slides. You know, like it says here, for cross-referencing, other groups may use the same idea with a different name or publish in different but also good conferences. So maybe within the reconfigurable area, we see lots of good publishing at FPL, FPT, FCCM, FPGA, but somebody that's doing related CAD work might be only publishing to ICCAD or DEC, or somebody that's doing only related operating systems work might be publishing to other conferences. And so you need to branch out of just the things that your advisor is directly related to and find other places that might have related work. So the infrastructure work is or search is one that's a little bit more difficult because people can use the infrastructure for a lot of different things, but people that all use the same tool may be doing similar work. And people that extend a tool to change it from the original tool name to their new name may also signify the same research direction. And so finding some tools that people are using and making sure that you know what people can do with the current state-of-the-art in research infrastructure can be an important technique as well. That cross-referencing finding new tools may help you find new groups, new keywords, and new conferences as well. So within the conference and journals, same idea. We want to identify the top conferences and journals where generally the conferences are more up to date in computer science fields. because conferences just have a faster publication schedule, so they have the most up-to-date content. And you should, for the set of top conferences, read every title and every abstract from those top conferences for the past few years. Lots of them won't be related to what you do. That's why you only read the abstract. That's our one little shortcut, is that you read the abstract and maybe not the whole paper.
And this is the key, don't go by titles. I mean, we all do this. I mean, you will learn this through experience. Our titles are all about the buzzwords that are most popular at that time of when you're writing the paper. It's no more, no less. Okay? So be very careful. Don't read a title and dismiss the paper. Generally, the contents are very different than what the title suggests.
So, and we say top, so the big question there is, what is a top conference or a top journal? So first of all, top is places that your advisor lets you publish in. Because if your advisor is good.
People in the set.
Well, I thought ATO has a list of top conferences in every area.
They do, but besides that list, only the ones that we let you publish in are actually the top conferences. So if you say, I want to submit to this conference, and your advisor says no, then it's probably not a very good conference. So even if it's in Hawaii or Ohio or Orlando, just because it's a nice place to travel to, in fact, more likely if it's a nice place to travel to, it's not a very good conference. So other things, places that other top groups are publishing in, but you need to be careful because sometimes top groups still send an occasional paper to second-tier conferences. And similarly, people with top people on the committee. So if you look at the program committee list and you notice that lots of the people that you think are very famous are on that list, then it's probably a pretty good conference. But in all of these cases, make your list and verify with your advisor because it's easy to make mistakes. Professors aren't immune to wanting to travel to nice places, and so sometimes they're on the program committee of a place because they get to go to Hawaii. And so just because you see famous names doesn't mean it's a top conference. You just want to make sure that you have a nice list.
There's also another thing. IEEE and ECM certification is an absolute minimum. And there are some conferences and workshops which don't carry the IEEE stamp, which means that the conference proceedings is some weird German publishing house that nobody knows about, and that's not going to count towards anything, any meaningful.
Yeah, but there are some exceptions to that.
Sure.
I know there are conferences which are really good, but they want to keep the costs down. I mean, the moment you associate with IEEE or ACM, you look at the conference registration costs, everything goes up. And there are some conferences.
Talk to your advisor,
yeah, they are exceptional, like 1 or 2 here and there. So be very careful. Yeah. And then about conference versus journal. Typically in computer science, I think it's probably true in FPGAs as well, that you generally write a conference paper first and then extend it to a journal. That's the most common process. Okay, so it's quite. I think it's safe to say that read your conference papers. If you find something really interesting, you want to know more about it, go and read the journal paper. But there are exceptions. There are papers that are directly sent to journals, very good papers, so you don't want to miss out on them. Especially survey papers. They would end up in journals most of the times.
Yes, yeah, surveys are very unlikely to be a conference paper because they're going to need more than the 8-page limit or the 10-page limit.
And also, yeah, I mean the argument that they don't necessarily say something new, right? So don't miss out on important journal papers, but at the same time, don't necessarily waste your time reading a whole bunch of journal papers which are 60 pages long, 50 pages long, right? I mean, there are generally conference versions. Figure out if it's really relevant to you, it's interesting to you, it's going to help you in your research, and then maybe look at the journal version, but don't miss it again.
So then, finally, in the citation search, this is something that you probably only want to do for the papers that you think are, especially relevant or especially good. But you say, what work are they based on? go search backwards and search backwards multiple generations of papers to find where's the paper that is the basis of all of the theory that this work is built on. And then what work comes afterwards? Who's citing it, and what have they done? What have they done next? Because you're going to find other groups that extended this work, or other groups that related that work to other fields, and so searching forwards and backwards to find who cited and where the citations came from can be good.
Sometimes it also helps, right? I guess you do mention inventions. To go to a Google patent search to find out who the inventor is, and if he has already patented the idea. It might not be published as a paper because of whatever patent restrictions, but if someone's already gone ahead and filed a patent, then maybe it's something to keep in mind that could be something citable.
Yeah. The contents of a patent might not be easy to decipher.
It has to be done in very specific cases.
Yeah.
If you have a new idea that you think is patentable.
Yeah. I mean, and the sort of the last point on this slide is how do you evaluate what a good paper is, or how do you evaluate what the most important paper in your field is? Well, there's a lot of different ways of judging that. If it's cited lots of times, if it's the one paper that's been cited 2,000 times and nothing else in that area has been cited more than 50 times, then you found the most important paper. But you also want to look for things that are the first inventor. You want to look for things that have well-written explanations so that they're actually useful for people that are reading your paper to find that for a better explanation. Sometimes, although not necessarily, you might want to look for the thing that has the famous author, because it's likely that it's coming from a good person. But the danger for that is that there's a tendency in research internationally that the rich get richer. So the people that get lots of citations become famous, and because they're famous, they get more citations because everybody says they're famous, and so I should cite them. And so being good is sometimes a little bit of luck, of being the person that got just famous enough that all of their papers in the future got the benefit of the doubt. And while you still want to properly look at that work and reference it, you should remember that there's other people who have done good work too that weren't lucky. And so you should look through some things that maybe didn't get so well cited, but they happened at about the same time, and they might be just as important.
And then I think a couple of points to make here. So one is, so sometimes if you follow citations, it will take you many years back in many papers, and you could spend 5 years just reading papers. So be careful. Use your advisor to seed your literature review. Okay? You don't have to read each and every paper published in your area. You can't do that. It's not feasible. Okay? Your advisor hopefully knows better, so ask him or her and seed your review process. Okay?
So we're doing a reading group at CHIPES for specifically the FPGA computing type fields. So that's one good way of starting from a curated list of well-known good papers, and then you can look at who cited these papers to build a tree of different citations from that known good list.
You could easily get lost in papers just reading them. So be very careful about that. And then about citations, another thing is I've often seen that if you look at a conference paper and look at references, it's not very difficult to guess what the program committee for that particular conference looked like. Okay? It's generally, you're a program committee member, every submission would try to cite you. So be very careful about citations again. It's a game. Yeah, don't get lost. Well, the trick there, if you want to get your paper cited, get your advisor on program committees of all conferences.
So the question is, up till now we've really been saying, look for stuff in your area, look for stuff in the conferences in your area. But if you're a beginning student, what's my area? I'm brand new. I haven't read things. I don't know what my area is. Is my area? I mean, maybe I hopefully know well enough that it's somewhere in computer engineering. But there's a lot of research in computer engineering. If you look down a list of the top conferences just in the hardware side of computer engineering, if you look at the top 20 conferences, the history of those conferences is published more than 30,000 papers. You're not going to read 300,000 pages of text to figure out what your area is. So it can be difficult to find your area.
You might want to also develop a technique to skim papers, right? Yes, you shouldn't read everything in detail, but if you can find a way to train yourself to only focus on what's relevant. You don't need to read the background survey of every paper. You can only look at the results, look at the conclusions, look at the abstract, and try and...
Once you spend a little bit of time in your area or sub-area or sub-problem or whatever you want to call it, I think you'll get more familiar. You'll know who are the people working in this. Whom should I follow in some sense. So it'll become easier as you progress in your PhD. Initially, it's probably going to be more challenging, and that's why you have an advisor, right? Otherwise, everyone would do a PhD without an advisor. So follow your advisor initially, but then use your own instincts. Once you learn, oh, here's this guy who works in very similar problems as I do, so I need to follow this person, and the group. I think it generally boils down to that eventually. A few people here and there in the world, you need to follow them until you graduate, and then.
Yeah, and some of the rest of the stuff on this slide is things that we've talked about a little bit earlier, but it's when in doubt, read more and cite more things, because there probably is more related work, and there's no harm in reading a few irrelevant papers. But as we're saying, you have to be strategic. You want a few % of the papers to have been, oh, I read this and it didn't turn out to be interesting. Not 80% of the papers I read have nothing to do with what I'm going to study. But one of the mistakes that I see people make often is to be over picky about what it means to be related. If it does anything that's remotely similar, it's related. No work that you read will be 100% exactly the same as what you're trying to do, so don't be over picky about what it means to be related. I've seen too many cases where people write a paper and say, I'm trying to do the CAD solution of this DSP data set for this particular FPGA. And someone says, well, what about this other paper? They also do CAD for general FPGAs. You say, oh, but it's not DSP, so not related. No, it's still related. Just because it's not exactly the same as you doesn't mean it's not related.
And if you can make that connection, that shows that you have an academic mind, that you can spot these patterns, that things that appear unrelated, if you just do a binary whatever equivalence, you're able to look at what's actually the connection between these unconnected things.
Yeah, I mean, and like we talked about, we gave a bunch of examples, including this one earlier. It does take some creative thinking, and as Nachiket talked about at the very beginning today, you need to give yourself some time to encourage that creative thought, because your related work can be from outside your field, and being the creative person that's the first to realize a connection between this field and things that people have done in other fields can be enough novelty to motivate your entire PhD thesis.
And then another thing is, I've been told that in NTU it's not that easy to travel to conferences for students, you don't get that much support. But if you ever happen to go to a conference, make sure you attend a lot of talks. That's one very easy way to get to know what's happening in the area, what people are working on. Some things that seem unrelated, you might see that it's really related to what you're doing, and that's another way of figuring out what are the groups, what they're working on. Go and talk to people.
Also go to the post-conference visits to the pub. I think a lot of creative thinking happens there. Back of the paper napkin.
I think it's really important.
Yeah.
It's,
Get an advisor who takes you on these pub tours. That's important.
And I mean, and quite seriously, even for those of you who may not drink or or whatever, the socializing part of going to a conference is an important part of that. Even if you choose not to participate in alcohol or whatever, it's important to meet people. And so,
and they're likely to give away the secrets when they're drunk. So it's
right. It's it's something that I know sometimes people can feel uncomfortable to be around alcohol if it's not the choice that you normally make for yourself. But if you can feel comfortable being around it, it can be very, very important because you'll meet more people, they'll remember you better, you'll get more information about the field, and so you build something in those socializing times at a conference that you can't get just by sitting in the room and listening to the talks. So don't worry about feeling like you have to participate in the drinking side.
Exactly.
Just come and socialize.
Personal constraints, feel free not to drink. In fact, just make sure you don't drink, right? If that's what you believe in.
But I think something more philosophical here. I think research, of course, it's about science. It's about being correct and precise and all that. But at the end of the day, it's about people. And your career essentially depends on a whole bunch of other people. Okay? So, of course you need to do good work. Of course you need to write good papers. But at the end of the day, there is some human there reviewing your paper. If that human knows you well, he can trust you more. Okay? And I think that's the key to success. Relationships. That's the secret.
It might sound silly, but actually it isn't. It's about, if you know somebody, if you have built a level of trust, you're obviously going to prefer that person or somebody who just looks good on paper.
Imagine a random reviewer in the world. He doesn't know you. He's reading your paper. He's going to be very skeptical the first time he sees a paper from anyone of you. He's like, wow, this is something new. Many of them use blind reviews and stuff like that, but it's very easy to predict where the paper is coming from. And it's also very easy to predict who is reviewing the paper. Once you spend a few years in your area, you see a review, you'll know, oh, I know who's written this paper. So these things are not that difficult to get.
Actually, I think it's more important that you make connections.
Yeah.
Not for getting people accepted, but for establishing your reputation in the field. And maybe getting an offer to go become a postdoc or join a company somewhere else. Right? So people like you, people like the way you've presented paper and you've socialized with them. You're laying the foundations of your own future.
So,
go ahead. Don't read papers like a novel. It's not a novel, please. Okay. I've seen many cases where, this is human tendency again. When we read novels, we tend to overlook certain words. We read a sentence, we read half a sentence and we guess what it is. This is happening subconsciously, okay? This is not a conscious decision. When you read a novel, you tend to read half a sentence and you know what the rest is going to say, you skip it, and you don't do that with a paper.
But I think I'm not completely sure I agree with this.
Okay.
Even when you write the paper, you should write it in a way that you're telling a story. Now, the thing is that the novel is a good analogy because it is telling you a story. So if a paper is something that is sort of leading you through a story, it's actually a good model for writing a paper.
So when you write a paper, write it like a novel. When you read a paper, don't read it like a novel.
Read it like a bit string. I
mean,
I think it's in the borderlines. Yeah.
But even there's you want to tell a story, and telling the story and guiding the reader through what they're going to do, or what you're doing and why is good.
Mm-hmm.
But going too far like a novel is bad.
Yeah.
Because when people write novels, they use interesting words. And they change up the ways that they describe things in order to make it more interesting and easier to and fun to read, but not necessarily clear.
Technically
And so
accurate, right?
and so
Don't sacrifice
if you write something and you say, oh well, I don't want to use the same word for my algorithm over and over because that's not interesting. You're going to confuse lots of people because they aren't going to know if you're talking about the same thing or multiple different things.
We'll talk about that tomorrow, right?
Yeah, so there'll be a whole talk about this tomorrow.
And I think this is the key probably in terms of the difference, the density. If you look at a paper, it's very dense. There are very few papers and very few authors who can write papers which don't appear dense in 10 pages. And most papers you will come across are going to be very dense. So be very careful. They use words. I mean, they use English, which is an imprecise language, to make things very precise. It's really confusing. So be very careful. Don't misinterpret. I think the key message here is don't be casual about reading papers. You don't want to misinterpret any sentences or any claims or any comments that the authors are making. So, full concentration is kind of necessary, I think, to really understand it.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. So, I think this is another key thing. So many times, this is personal experience. You start reading a paper, you want to understand everything here in that. Yeah? You want to really know the paper well. Sure enough, that's a good goal to have. But sometimes you might get stuck. I mean, keep in mind, authors had a limit on the page, right? They just cannot express everything they want to express. And you might get stuck somewhere. You might not understand a certain proof or a certain theorem or a certain lemma or certain aspects of the paper. That should not prevent you from continuing. So the goal of literature review is essentially to get the essence of the paper. What is it talking about? What is the high level view here? Conceptually, what is it trying to do? Of course, you need to know the details. And of course, for some papers which are really related to your area, you need to really know the details well. But let that not prevent you from reading a paper. Keep that in mind. Okay? That's very important, I think.
Yeah, I mean, and it's, and I guess the important thing to think about that is that, yes, you want to understand the details, but don't get too worried about understanding all of the details on the first time. Because if this is a paper that is related work, but not something that you're building on for your own research, you're not going to remember the details in 3 months anyway. But you should be able to remember the general concept and the importance, and you should know that well enough so that if you need to know the details, you know that you can pick the paper up again and reread it for the specific details that you need to remind yourself of.
Yeah, so I think in terms of the review process, I personally think there are two important things that you need to do when you review papers. One is understand. And I've put the definition of understand there just to make sure everyone is clear what I mean by that. Okay. So, understanding a paper does not necessarily mean reproducing the sentences that's there in the paper in your summary. Okay. Everyone can do that. I can take a couple of sentences from the abstract of the paper and put it in the summary and say, hey, I know the paper well. When I mean understand the paper, it's in some sense, I don't know if everyone here understands what I mean by internalize. You really have to understand the paper conceptually. What is it? What are the key ideas? Okay. What problem is being solved? What assumptions are being made? Are the assumptions too restrictive? You have to be critical about it as well at the same time. Okay. It's very important to really, really, really understand the paper, not just read it for the sake of reading it. Okay. That happens many times, and even now we do that mistake. You read a paper, you think you understood it, but you're not sure. Okay. And this comes out very easily when you write your own paper and you write related work or whatever. You will generally cite a paper, and you'll copy a couple of sentences from their abstract or introduction describing what that paper is doing, and then you leave it at that. You really don't know what the paper is about. How does it relate to what you're doing? The pros and cons and stuff like that. So be careful about that. Really, really understand the paper. Again, understand.
And just one quick note there of there's a slight impreciseness in how Arvind said that. And so just to be very clear, if you write a paper where you copy sentences from another paper, that is wrong, and we will all be very, very mad. So if you copy the meaning, that's fine. But the thing is that you should be able to demonstrate by what you write about it that you understand more about what the paper is saying than what the paper is telling you.
Yeah. And the other thing to remember is when you write a background section for your own paper, you say this previous work did X, and then explain the context of how your paper is different. I've read a lot of papers where they just say this guy did this, this guy did this, this guy did this, and that's it.
Yeah. And then
that's not enough. Yeah.
And then it's for the reviewer to figure out
exactly what the connection.
Not different. Are you really doing something different?
Yeah, and we'll talk about that a little bit more in a couple slides.
Oh, and then the perspective. I think this is the other important thing when you read a paper. So one thing is to understand what is it about, what is it really doing, what problem is it solving. Another thing is perspective. So what I mean by perspective, again, definition is there, but is you need to place the paper in this big puzzle. You need to identify what piece of the puzzle is it really solving. How does it fit with the rest of the literature in that area? And this is essentially critical thinking, right? You want to understand how the paper compares with the rest of the literature that you've already read. How are its contributions different? Is it really significant, not significant? What are the key ideas you can take from it, which other papers didn't have? So I think this notion of being able to, and this is a learning experience again. Initially when you read papers, you probably are not going to be easily able to put it in perspective. You might understand it well, but you might need some help putting it in perspective. But later on, I think now, for example, when I read a paper, I generally look for the perspective before I even try to really understand it well. Because I'm thinking about how does it fit in the big picture, what puzzle is it solving, what pieces are being left unsolved. And these might not be explicit. Yeah, be careful about that. Not everything in the paper is going to be explicit. You might have to interpret.
And it's important here that when you're thinking about the fundamentals, contributions, or the remaining open problems, don't expect the authors of the paper to do the work of being creative for you. Any halfway decent paper is going to make a claim that they did something very important. That's their job, is to argue that they did something important. Your job is to read the paper and decide for yourself whether what they did is truly important. And similarly, some papers are going to say, this is what I'm going to work on next. Well, half of the time, the things that they say they're going to work on next omit the things that they think are really interesting, because they don't want to tell anybody what's really interesting and I'm going to work on next. So,
or worse still, they've already worked on what they're saying they want to work on next. So they already know the solution to what they want to work on. Yeah, and so you're basically not going to, you're fighting a losing battle. You try to work on what they say they're working on.
Right. So don't expect the paper to tell you what is left to study. You're going to have to be able to, not just by reading one paper, but by reading many papers together, understand what is really left to be done. And this is why you need to spend so much time on the creative process, is because you can't come up with the ideas on what needs to be done next just by finding a list that somebody has already produced and picking something off of that list of, okay, I'm going to solve number 7. No, it's you have to come up with an idea of your own. So The last thing that is important for the review process is summarization. I've seen way too many literature reviews, whether it's a confirmation report, a PhD thesis, or an individual conference or journal paper, where instead of actually performing a literature review, they give me a paragraph by paragraph summary of every paper they've ever read in their life, and no context. And so the important thing here is, what are the common themes? What are the common strategies? What do papers have in common? What differentiates them? Can I come up with some sort of way of comparing lots of papers, of saying, okay, here's 10 different categories of features that papers in my area might have, and I'm going to classify every paper in terms of what it supports. And what this probably means is you're going to end up rereading papers, because when you're doing your first pass, maybe your first thing that you do is you think, okay, I know these 3 categories, and you're going to read 10 papers and categorize every one of them, and then on the 11th paper, you're going to realize that you need a 4th category. And what does that 4th category mean? It means you have to reread the first 10 papers to decide whether they also have that 4th that force value. And so it's going to be a process, but this is the most important part of it, is giving you some information that can quantify what's still unsolved and how are you going to do something different. This is the step where you've putting together all of the hard work of reading dozens or hundreds of papers and giving you a single summary that says, this is the thing that no one's done before, and this is what I'm going to concentrate my effort on. And so if you read 100 papers and you don't do this last step, you've wasted your work. So take the time, make sure that you summarize well. Together with that is archival, to make sure that you take advantage of your time to do this categorization, taking notes, writing short summaries that you can reuse later for your thesis. Because no matter how good you do it, you will need to reread some papers, but your goal should be that you need to reread a small percentage of papers, not that I read 100 papers before I started on my research, and then I did a year and a half of research, and now it's time to write my confirmation exam or my PhD thesis, but I don't remember what any of those papers said anymore, and so now I need to reread all 100 papers before I can make a related work section. So take notes, categorize, make sure that you're only going to need to reread a few things so that you don't have a much tougher job of making your thesis.
Well, yeah, this is something I personally believe in. I think you need to dream about research. I mean, there will be moments, I hope, in each of your lives where you will be like, you're taking a shower or you're going to sleep, and you're thinking about something you worked on, okay, during the day, and suddenly you realize, hey, that was how it was. That was
it's sort of a eureka moment.
Yeah, it's like your eureka moment. Yeah, and this happens, believe me. If you really spend time, I mean, come on, how many hours does your advisor expect you to work every week? 100, 150? I don't know. So
about 170.
Okay.
I think there's 100.
So Kyle wants you to work 170 hours a week. So when you start doing that, this will happen. And keep in mind, this is, I think, this is the essence, essentially. When you do literature reviews, you should do it in a way that things are at your fingertips when you want them. You don't need to know all the details. You don't need to know the specific techniques or approaches that papers have used or anything like that. What you need to know is, you're working on a problem, you get stuck somewhere, you don't know how to solve this particular sub-problem or sub-sub-sub-problem. You should be able to go back to your memory and say, hey, these are the papers I've read. did I encounter anything similar in any of them? That's all you need, right? If you did, then you know you can go back. It's very difficult to actually go back to a paper to figure out, hey, there was this paper that I read 2 years ago that did something very similar. I need to pick that, and I need to reread, maybe look at the techniques there, apply it. And that's generally what research is all about, I think, today. Most of the solutions are out there in the literature. It's about you figuring out whether you can get hold of it and use it, apply it in what you're doing. Okay?
And it's just a way to be efficient, right? You don't want to read when you read.
Exactly. And you probably will not end up getting it either. I mean, there is so much out there. If you don't have this process of somehow having these one-line summaries of papers in your head, somewhere out there, the buzzwords, the keywords for each, your own buzzword, your own archive, you want to call it. And then if you need to be able to reproduce it very quickly. I think that's the key. Anything else, guys? Oh yeah, this is another thing. I think everyone here goes through this. Don't get intimidated by big names. In the beginning, when you read a paper from a famous author, you tend to believe everything the author says. And this is blind faith. Every one of us goes through this. Don't do that. Really be critical of every paper you read. Make sure you understand, you interpret it the way you want to. It doesn't matter. I mean, at the end of the day, that big author was someone like you a few years ago, a few decades ago. Right? So they all go through this learning curve. It's very easy. Look at papers published by a famous author. Pick some of their really early papers. You will see the difference, how they've evolved over years, how the quality of their paper has improved over years. So never go by names. Okay? Even in a conference, when you meet someone famous, sure, listen to them, and they'll have a lot of good piece of advice. But put your own judgment to it. That's important. Don't get intimidated. I think that's the key. Of course, you should never question your advisor. He's paying you money, right? So you cannot do that. That's the only exception.
What do you mean?
But
never question your advisor.
no, they're always right. But seriously, we also make mistakes.
Oh.
So new ideas are welcome, and we want you to have new ideas, and we want you to question what we're saying, and find and have an argument about research. But if you're going to have the argument, justify with more than intuition. Have papers, have data, have something that says, I'm not just questioning you because I'm mad today. I'm questioning you because I can prove that what you think isn't true, and I can demonstrate it.
Yeah, I mean, this was just a joke, okay? So don't follow this, please.
I got misled a little bit.
Yeah, your advisor got misled. So
Yes.
really, don't get misled. Question your
Don't
advisor.
question me on this.
Argue with them as much as you can. And I think, again, this is personal experience. So I don't know if everyone goes through this, but one of the indicators of a successful PhD is when you graduate, you no longer want to meet your advisor for the next few years. You've seen him enough, you've fought with him enough. That's it, yeah. So make sure you do that.
Yeah, I mean, I have a slightly different thing, but as my advisor always said, that you're not ready to graduate until you can tell me to my face that I'm wrong and make me believe it. and it's like, and when you can do that, even just once, it's like, okay, you're ready to graduate. So
Better do it in 4 years.
Yeah, and another indicator is how often you meet your advisor. As you're closer to graduation, you tend to meet him or her less and less. Slowly.
Depends.
It goes away. Oh really? Was it the other way for you?
Because I was writing my thesis.
Right.
So I met him almost every 3 days. It was ridiculous.
Wow.
It was painful. And it was
I was meeting Katie every 8 hours. it's like the morning meeting, the afternoon meeting, and then just work through the night and be ready for the next morning meeting. So
Yeah, that's another trick advisors play a lot. They always have Monday morning meetings with students. You all know why.
No, you can't give away our secrets.
Okay. I think
Okay, that's it for us.